No.
Haven't got long enough till that. I have to be careful when I turn the red light on myself when I don't.
Yeah, I was just seeing if it looks like it can hear me, and it looks like it can hear you.
Yeah, good.
So, okay.
So,
So,
keep this piece of paper on it?
absolutely, yeah. In fact, I don't see the piece of paper in the viewing field because I'm seeing you from about here to here. So that's perfect. So I'm just going to ask you the questions that I had emailed you, and then give you a chance to respond to each of them. So let's start back at the beginning, and I'll ask, why did you join SPR?
Well, as I had told you before, it's more a question of how did SPR come along and get me instead of me joining SPR, because of post-war experience where I became interested in physiological measurements. And somewhere in there, the measurements we made were things like blood volume and skin impedance. Partly because I was at an institution, Southern Cal, where people had previously done work with the GSR and had some antique equipment around. I'd been hired to set up a laboratory and obviously had to grab off all the equipment that was left over from pre-war, and they were pretty ancient. And I named like Hathaway come to mind, I don't know whether that. But in any rate, there were a few instruments around. And we started to make our own, and we started learning about Darrow bridges and things. And then setting up a laboratory meant I could teach a course on instrumentation. And doing that provided me a nice contact with other researchers. At SC, we had a centrifuge, one of the few in the country, where we were very much interested in physiological measurements under high G force. The physiological department, which was basically next door, was instrumenting apes for the first post-public. Before we had anybody go up, it was their job to put these apes on our centrifuge and set them around. So I got involved in that, of course, because I was training people, and it became quite interesting. People in the vicinity, Los Angeles, were quite interested. People very little heard of now. Gus Winger at UCLA was very much in measuring autonomic balance. So we heard a lot about sympathetic versus parasympathetic balance. And it was very interesting. And Lee Travis had come from Iowa as an EEG person who wanted to cure stuttering by increasing alpha content. So he fed me his graduate students, and I got one of his PhD, who was an excellent stutterer, who was my special technical help. And not sure we did much good for his speech problem, but we built some wonderful circuits because of his knowledge of electronics. Well, those are all historical elements that couldn't help but lead me into what amounts to the instrumentation side of things. Got to be a gadgeteer, made instruments, wrote to people who made instruments, and of course everybody those days was making their own instrument. Al Axe was a close friend at that time. He'd just done his dissertation, I think it was at Harvard, that was very well publicized, trying to tell the difference between autonomic responses to fear and anger. I thought it was a cute experiment, so it was great for teachers. I used Al's materials. But those were the period at which we found ourselves, Lindsley was at UCLA and was a student of the EEG, and we had Travis, so we had two good EEG men right in our lab, which is pretty good if you're learning things, because I began to learn things from all these people. And as I think I told you that quite long before the war came along, this was the second one for me. The Korean War, he said, that guy knows a little bit about electronics. Let's call him back and tell us why our radar isn't working. So gadgeteers would be sympathetic to this, because in those days, everything you did depended on your knowledge of every darn resistor and capacitor in the place. None of these integrated circuits that you plugged in and took out. So even out on shipboard, we had to do our repair piece by piece, part by part. So I thought that was a pretty good education. That's when I decided, after I left the Navy, to put it in the form of this book that I mentioned, which was a history book more than anything, because it showed pictures of chimegraphs and tube circuits when people no longer nowadays thought about tubes. But that was about 54 when that happened. Al acted up long about it and got interested in communicating with the rest of us about his interests. And before we knew, we had a group of 12, 15 or more people circulating this news letter. And it was sort of nice, because what it did is it brought a lot of us together. I mean, that's when I bumped into people who, like, I wrote notes to make sure I remembered who it was. People like Bob Elberg and Wilcott, and we don't remember anymore. Bernie Engel, of course, John Stern was active then. Chester Darrow, Sidney Margolin, who was the medic, Martin Ornay from Pennsylvania, who stayed with us for years. Clint Brown, who was quite an instrument man, able to write later a book on how to make equipment for psychophysiology, which apparently is still available in some sources. Roscoe Dykeman at Arkansas, and on I could rattle off these names of the people who circulated this newsletter. And somehow or another, through osmosis or something, we would meet at APA meetings, and we'd have a drink together or something. Finally, the small group said, let's organize into a society. So that's how I got into SPR, as I was there. Mm-hmm. But I wasn't there at that meeting. I wasn't one of the people who signed the charter, but I was no doubt there the same year, but they're usually just a little select group of 6 or so people. Maybe the historian knows exactly who signed the paper that said we had an organization, but I didn't. So that's the way it all got started. By that time, we started to broaden out a lot. Another reason for doing GSR was people used the involuntary aspects of it for a lot of things back in the 40s. After World War II, I did work with malingerers, because a lot of people would apply for hearing aid. And I built up something that was called GSR audiometry. It got to be publicly available. You could buy a GSR audiometer. Mm-hmm. So at that time, we used that technique of GSR conditioning of auditory things to catch malingers. So we did that, and it wasn't long before was a John Tracy clinic. We learned about that, and we were giving talks around the country on GSR audiometry. John Tracy Clinton said, "Oh, come on, help us tell when kids, young kids who are deaf, really have an organ deficit or some other contributor." So I got hooked up to a research program, the Tracy Clinic, all psychophysiology, but and it was about the time at the beginning of the society when we were finding things to do to be useful, I guess. But I guess about this time, I can't really understand why people got so interested, but the state of California got interested and they gave me a grant to set up psychophysiology labs in hospitals. So I had one up in Northern California to condition, which had become an interest was conditioning, with mentally defective kids. So I had a monograph or so back then about this same period when the society was organizing, at which we found it beneficial. The VA sponsored laboratories. I had labs all over. We didn't call them psychophysiology labs. We called them something else, but only later did the term become popular. Still nobody knows what it is. And ask me, what do you do?
Yeah.
Afraid to say psychology, they think this thing and something else. You say psychophysiology, we're in trouble. But whatever year, it was about 64, we finally got together and put out this first volume. Look at the date here, see? 64. That was the first volume. So this bunch of people who'd been doing this mimeograph thing pretty much became a contributing agent to this journal. So I look at pretty much the people who've been talking about it.
Yes.
Then most of us had some kind of an article in that first volume. Axe had good ones, I think, and Chester Darrow had good ones. So historically, it's pretty much, they all have something in there. Mine was on habituation, I think, of oriented behavior. But, well, enough said. I've about used up that question of yours, so you'll have to give it a chance to proceed.
Okay. So, from when you finally became SPR, and my first question presumed that there was an SPR to join, but you set me straight on that. Why did you more or less form SPR? But what was the biggest change you saw in SPR over the years?
Well, we had a lot of those changes. I would not originally have thought of this as a big change, but there was a big change when biofeedback came along, because biofeedback got so darn independent as a clinical tool. Well, you know, it split off. And so you'd have to say that was a change, but I don't think it was a change in that sense. It's just somebody went off on a tangent. So that's that. The bigger change might be, from a historical point of view, that we were all, call them peripheral people, but skin people and heart people and muscle people back in the beginning. And people aren't as thrilled about impedance of the skin so much anymore as they were then. So we've shifted over to the brain a lot and become neural people, which fortunately is a lot more fun. But I think of that sometimes as the biggest change, but technical changes are tremendous. We used to have, as always, our meetings, and we would sit around and talk about equipment, and so you just, as I recall, we had a journal, and I have bad memory now, It seemed to me we even had journal equipment that came out for a while that some member of the society edited. But that's odd that I don't remember that. But anyway, we had technical changes because computers came along and they tried to teach us how to deal with bits. And I got my first DEC 8 and went up to the digital equipment company and learned how to make an operating system, OS 8 we called it. And it was taught us up there. That's how we learned to go to the company. But then we got to the point where we didn't have to record things on punch cards or tapes, and they got to a lot more magnetic things, and then it shifted over to other types of memory devices, but sure that changes. So those are the technical changes, they're great. The subject matter changes are great. The people changes, I think, are great. But since I'm not very good at keeping up on literature, it looks to me as if we've got a broadening of the field to where it's open to a lot more areas, especially those that are basically neural. And I wouldn't want to be in it anymore without being familiar with central nervous system more. We were all peripheral nervous system in the old days. So that did those changes.
Were there tensions over the years between the people who self-identified more with the autonomic measures and then when people came in and started to bring in these central measures?
I think so. Of course, you mentioned people like Manny Donchen, and who had quite an influence on people who could be such a good teacher. Most of it, of course, that triggers how some of these things come about. When you get in at the beginning, you have some disadvantages. I remember making my first instrument on evoked potentials back when we were doing GSR audiometry. Somebody came up to me and said, we got these things called evoked potential. We ought to be able to use an evoked potential to decide what the signal was getting to the nerve. So anyhow, we didn't have any response averaging computers in those days. So we took our old polygraphs, forget who made most of them, but same company, and we could add gates and various kinds of timing devices, and before we were through, we could average our own thing on a polygraph. So we actually got ourselves crude evoked potentials on a polygraph. But that's history all the way. You do that all the way, I guess, along the way. Stumble on something new and try it. So, but
were there concerns about the identity of the society as you started to broaden to these new measures?
I used to wonder. I reflected it a lot from England when I went to England, because it was beginning to become international. We were not international at first. We had a few. Peter Venables got interested very early, and Peter became a very close friend of mine, for example. But there were just 2 or 3 people in Europe who were playing around with things. And so we just saw it expand tremendously. We got postdocs. I get postdocs from Europe for a year or 2, and then they'd go back and things like that. So we started to. We also lost a lot of interest in areas. We got into these Licken and Raskin, the 2 of them, Dave Raskin and Dave Licken. Remember? Did you know Dave Raskin? And their little fuss over validity things.
They did not see eye to eye.
So those things go on in the society, and that's when I probably chaired the ethics committee or something.
Yes.
But so Dave, of course, was switching now the history of the he was at Utah, and
Dave
Bill,
Raskin.
Bill Procase was at Utah at that time. And so it was my pleasure to go visit them and talk with their faculty. But that brings in new people like that changed Procase. He's quite a different type of person, more of a politician, more ready to go up. Eventually became vice president or something. He didn't stay in the lab very long. And but those people were influential, and we even attracted some psychiatrists who stayed close friends of mine through the years. A fellow named Ziskin. Did you ever know Ziskin?
Sounds
That's Ziskin? Yeah. Anyhow. But we had these people who would always come to meetings. Every year we had this same fellow who was, well, he wrote the first book, which I have, called Psychophysiology or something. Another fellow named Troll wrote a book called Psychophysiology that I remember. But, well, anyhow, Jean Ziskin, wife was also a psychiatrist, so the two of them got to be close friends of mine because she lived up into her range. So, well, where am I going? Nowhere. So you better go to another question.
Okay. So this one should be an interesting one. What was the first piece of psychophysiological equipment that you owned?
That I what?
That you owned.
Oh.
Or used, yes. So what was the first equipment that you, I guess it should be, what was the first piece of psychophysiological equipment that you used?
I was, would have been a bridge. Because they were fairly simple. Wheatstone bridge. With a galvanometer. Oh. And reflecting maybe on a chimograph or something. Part of teaching, of course, that's part of teaching students how to do things. That was first.
Now, was that something you built yourself?
All those things were things you built yourself.
Okay. And what was the hottest topic in psychophysiology when you started your career?
Hottest?
Yeah.
Oh dear. Interesting question, because I can't really find it to be that self-evident of the topic. But of course, it's easy to see that I was preoccupied. I had started out being interested in psychophysiology as a way to get a response to study conditioning. My thing was classical Pavlovian conditioning. That's where people like Procase and Black and a lot of these learning theorists got interested in us GSR people, because we were dealing with learning certain questions. So I'd have to say that I had this big bias produced by my interest in learning theory. Because I was from, they used to joke, my students would always joke about being in the tradition of Hull, Yale, Hull, and Kenneth Spence, so forth. So we were affected much by that bias. Other people, emphasized Lang was all into understanding the nature of emotion. And, of course, Fran Graham had her own interest in the child side of things. And her husband, whom you didn't have much chance to know, I guess, because he died. But he was the most productive, fascinating physician that you could think of, and wrote these books on psychophysiology. And I had the benefit of stealing some of his illustrations from my own book. So, but then he had a tragic twist health-wise. And I tend to use a personality. Now people like Margolin get starting, whether you're talking personality or not, but you got off into people. Margolin was at the University of Colorado and had a beautiful big laboratory in psychophysiology from the medical in the hospital. He was a physician. And so people like him and Martin Ornay and others had quite an influence of giving us that input. Lacey was very well grounded in physiology, and so when it came to being specific about things, used to give some of us trouble because he'd say things, and then I'd teach a class in psychophysiology, and these pre-medic students, of course, always know more than you do, so they were always piping up about something John was saying, how to defend John. But you know, pre-medic students, they're great people to try to put you down so that they look good. Mm-hmm. It used to be quite a chore to handle them. So much for psychophysiology, because you're in a fun field that they don't know who you are or what you're doing there. Especially when we later got training grants sponsored in psychophysiology, which I had, and which I would have liked to have seen develop more, but did not. Either we were ahead of ourselves or we just couldn't cut it, because it takes people, and the people I hired were more interested in other aspects than we were writing our grants for. I don't know if they're making sense at this point, but we were often supported for research that we made some good, but we didn't get it done because our staff wanted to do something more along their own interests. And then I would hire somebody and they wouldn't catch on. You had to get a certain class of people who were interested in the weird combination of interests that psychophysiologists have, I think, which is sort of an experimental physiological bent with a dose of social stuff thrown in. Mm-hmm. But we haven't mentioned one thing which I can't let go by, and that's the revolution in technology that occurred when solid state came in.
But in fact, that may be the answer to the question you're anticipating, which is I was going to ask you what the most significant technological advance was to make your life easier in the lab over your career.
It's obvious that it was that shift from analog to digital. And it tested us a lot because we first had to write programs to handle converters in our crude equipment, like a decade. But we had to learn what a bit was. I never forget how they impressed me by saying, bit number one, that's an address bit. Bit two is this bit. These bits are for your data. I thought, what?
So you were writing at the machine.
Right, the machine language.
Yeah, right.
But that's quite a revelation. Plus the fact that it didn't take current anymore. The old equipment that with tubes was a big user of current. It was really electronic. And when these solid state things came on, you got activity without a whole lot of current. It was kind of a shift technologically. I need a shift toward culpability. We talked too much beforehand.
I'm sorry. So when you first got in the laboratory, then you were fabricating your devices yourself. What point were you able to actually obtain satisfactory devices that you didn't have to fabricate yourself?
Well, that came along quite early. Still trying to remember the company in Chicago, you might remember it, that made their reputation building EEGs and things. That anyhow, they came along quite early. It all started, of course, with the Holworth machines. And even our original factor analyses were done with adding machines, these Holworth card computing things. Mm-hmm. We could use progressive digiting to multiply and all that stuff.
And so how long would that take you to do a factor analysis that way?
It wasn't too bad after you got punch cards. You could do them in a night. Uh-huh. You'd spend the night in the lab. Right. But it was hard to keep up with all that stuff. I had to go one summer at the University of Chicago where these Thurston or somebody teaching people how to do factor analysis on these punch cards, and I was having a hard enough time learning how to make a punch card, let alone make it work. So anyhow, that's the way it was done, of course. Mm-hmm. And then it didn't take long to switch them over to more rapid, which were also hard for some of us to assimilate. I mean, when the first computers came out, they would try to train some of us, and I'm sure we were pretty slow learners. The first, names of the companies that put them out early, you may remember the names, the really early computer racks, but they embarrassed me by...
There were the PDPs and the...
Yeah, the PDPs were quite a long time later.
Okay.
Earlier, they had this cute little name for them, whatever they were. And they would come. Mm-hmm. But those things come along to where you get to a point where you don't maintain. I do well to keep up with my whatever I use the current computers for, downloading messages and things about my speed today, so I don't think about that anymore. I laugh. I have SPSS on my machine, never use it. Some of these old static programs that we struggled with. So it's a whole sequence of experiences. I don't know if I had any notes that I could rely on.
Well, I did want to offer you. I did want to offer you a chance to offer any other observations on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of our society.
Something that I would wish not to mention, but tend to, I guess. The tendency, how easy it is to get away from it. How you don't read it anymore. Now, one reason you don't read it, of course, is that journal isn't available. I've had a problem with this entirely because of on and off. They try to do a consistent job about fees, and some years they would list you as a life member if you were a member before 64 or 48 or something. And before you know it, you've dropped off on another list. And then you, at least I've had 2 years off and on when I've had hiatuses where I didn't get the journal. And that doesn't help, but at the same time, when I do get them again, I say, oh my God, it jumped, way ahead of me. What is it? So I'm not sure I'd even read them. Although the last ones I was getting, I gave one copy to, what's her name? Sarah. I thought she'd heard me talk about you, and you had this article that I thought was interesting to both of us, so I gave her a copy. I don't know what she did, but anyhow, you've had that much.
Well, if you have trouble with your membership and subscription, I can make that work for you. So,
Well, I'm sure that you could. People in the past have.
yeah.
And it's often a case of the mechanics of the publisher, not the society.
Right.
I'm not really worried about it. I don't really want a change in that nowadays. I mean, I've got to the point where I can't even read the newspaper. I can't read 5 minutes. We're going blind, both my wife and I. So you just don't do things anymore.
Yeah.
So no, I'm not interested in reading anything. I can't even read my stocks and bonds papers anymore.
Okay.
And they're still fun.
But anyway, if there's trouble with it, you let me know, okay?
Sure enough.
So, other things on the occasion of the 50th that you think would be of interest to members who have been with the society anywhere from 1 to probably 40 or more years?
Well, it's a rather hard thing to respond to because, first of all, maybe you're supposed to see it, but you go with it and adjust to it as it goes along. So it's sort of overly trite to simply say 50 years has been a long time and a lot has happened. That's basically what it comes to. So you could not start what we really meant talking about is things that used to be that aren't really critical today. And so, but if you're going to deal with those things that are of priority importance today, some of us would be loath to say, because we're not in it. I don't know the refined points to the extent that I might have. And after a while, you just say, well, that's for other people. Yes!
Hilda has company.
Hi.
Well,
here?
goodness. Hi, Debbie.
I have another book.
Oh, you do? Well,
Hi.
Hello.
Hilda is
It's,
napping.
okay, well, you just
And
give it to
I'll-
her.
I'll give it to her. We've
And
enjoyed
it's
the
another
master.
one. It's another one with big letters. You know,
Well,
she's
we
very
need those.
famous. Yeah, and you keep
Yeah.
them here for the next
We will
people.
do that.
Okay, they might like it. Hello.
Hi.
Thank you. It's
So
a
I'm going to
colleague from the university.
What?
A colleague from the university.
Oh, hi.
I'm
Psychologist.
John
Look it
Allen.
up. Look
We're
it
thinking
up.
for that.
Hi.
Her husband is Nico Bloomberger. Everybody wants to know. Nico, don't do this, huh? She said, don't do this to me. Okay. Everybody knows her husband.
So long. Nice to
Thanks.
meet you.
He's a Nobel Prize winner, her husband.
You have a few of those already.
He's so much of something, but she's funny. Nice person. You can see what she's doing. She's feeding.
That's great. That's great.
She's she takes it upon herself to be a helpful person. It's nice we have people out there like that. But she and her husband, Nico's 90, so he's a part of us, the old class. And he's, in case you don't know about him, his major claim to fame is lasers. He invented lasers.
Wow.
So that's where he comes in the picture. He's quite a stellar member of your faculty. But as most when the star still shines in Europe, they'll be off to Europe because he's European. And he'll be giving talks in Europe as long as he's physically able.
Wow.
He is.
Yeah.
Still plays tennis.
Wow.
So, but we have a joke because for a while I was oldest and he was next old. So maybe that's still true. I don't know. But so much for the people here and her. It was a nice intervention. I see her. It's still on. So God knows what's on your tape.
Well, we'll edit it down.
You edited
Let
that.
me ask the last question one other way and just see what you think. So, there was the group of you that you'd mentioned who came together around really equipment issues, and you wrote the Polygraph newsletter and circulated it. Do you think in the back of your mind you thought that this group would last 50 years? Did you see it as founding something of that?
I don't think
enduring?
any more than Bill Gates thought that the laptop would ever come along either, So, in fact, I don't think we worried much about it. We were so interested in current things that the future wasn't our bailiwick. I'll bet we all thought that we are where we are, meaning they're pretty crude, and it'll only get better. And of course, the digital change, the change in math shook everybody. In fact, suddenly thought differently about things. And even now, I sit and listen to people talk about cosmology from not psychological point of view, but from the basic general physics point of view, and I can't believe what dreaming we do in terms of what's all out.
Right.
And those didn't exist at that time. Have now turned clinical because going back to when I was trained as a clinician, back in the 40s, 40, 41, the experiences I had and the colleagues I had, the training I had, were such a universe different. Our psychiatrists were, in a way, they were weird. They were looking for ways, We had a few people that were non-directive therapists, and nobody's ever heard the word cognitive was nasty back then, by the way. I had colleagues who poo-pooed me because in '73, I think it was, I wrote an article on cognitive interpretation of electrodermal material while at London, and it's one of the nicest responses I got from a psychiatrist in London. Maudsley came up and said that he thought that was good. Well, it makes you feel good when something does that. Yeah. But others would say, no, you don't talk about cognition. Now everybody stumbles over the word. I don't even know what it means anymore. So I have to be careful not to use it. So it's fascinating to think where we're going. Maybe that's what the answer is. Another 50 years, somehow we're going to really discover how signals transmit, and not that we don't have a very good idea now, but about synaptic transmission and so forth, but it's still kind of crude. It's still like electrons running down a wire, really. You try to think of it, what's going on, you just think of some kind of thing going on. And the tissue and the speed with which things happen, and the fact that so many of them are permeable in the sense that the air is conducting so much of information that God knows where we're going to be in understanding one another when we get to the point when we can catch all that junk that's out there. I don't know whether they're going to become little receivers and transmitters, but
right.
it's there's a world out there.
Right.
And you never would have thought of it 50 years ago, because we had, what did your mother do that could have left this lasting impression upon you?
Right.
That's why you're having this difficulty we call schizophrenia. It's because your mother didn't treat you right. I read an article, it's still out there, called My Shrunk, or It Shrunk, My Shrunk. you read it?
I saw it. It's on my list to read. Yeah,
It's
this is the woman's account of her experience, right?
yeah, she wants from every analyst to the next. And since I spent a lot of time friends of mine were analysts, I kind of enjoyed the fact that how it goes, because her parents chose her analysts naturally, good Jewish parents, and they would all be a good Jewish therapist. And then she talked a lot about their influence in her love life and how much that permeated. There's still a lot of influence within subgroups that is not all so evident as you see it in a story like that.
Right.
I don't think there's much about therapy in that red darn thing. And all that goes is jump from Dr. O to Dr. L to Dr. T to Dr. Z and so forth. So. But that's an interesting, up-to-date article.
Well, I'm going to pause the camera then, but I wanted to thank you for taking the time to.
Well, it's been a
provide
pleasure,
that
obviously. I haven't had a chance to ventilate like this for a long time.
Well, we'll have to make